Join On the Other Hand today for this.
Legislators come into a session for 4 months and they will vote on as many as 2,000 pieces of legislation. They can't possibly be well versed on every one of those pieces of legislation. And so part of our role is to educate them.
This is On the Other Hand. A podcast sponsored by Braver Angels in Arkansas that explores politics and other issues of importance to Arkansans. And we do this through having conversations with community leaders. So stay with us as we talk to another leader in Arkansas who works across differences to get things done and to bring us closer together.
Hello and welcome to On the Other Hand. I'm your host, Glenn White, and as usual, I have April Chatham Carpenter here as my co-host. So on our podcast, April and I interview, as you know, various community leaders in Arkansas who in some way are helping solve problems and reaching across various political divides or other kinds of divides within the community. So let's see who we have today. April, who is it?
Glenn, I'm excited. We have a conversation today with Ann Clemmer, and Ann has had multiple roles in the state of Arkansas, certainly has made a difference over the years for Arkansans, maybe even some behind the scenes. So we're going to find out more about that. She's a former state representative for the Arkansas General Assembly. She's been a former senior associate director for governmental relations and special projects for the Arkansas Department of Higher Education. And I love that she's been a college professor here at UA Little Rock and elsewhere, of course, as I am in that role as well. And now Ann works for the Capital Consulting firm here in Little Rock. So welcome to On the Other Hand, Ann.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Well, Ann, I'd love to just get us started with people getting to know a little bit more about how you got started working in politics and related fields. So tell us a little bit about that story.
Okay, I'll keep this one sort of brief because, you said I've done several things. Well, that's, I guess, part of what happens as you age, is if you don't quit, then you keep doing stuff and your resume gets a little bit longer. I got interested in politics at an unusually early age. I'm sure Glenn, as a psychologist, could dissect me 10 ways to Sunday. But we had a very big race in my hometown when I was 10 years old, a race for Congress. Both gentlemen were from a small town. And so we felt like we were the center of the absolute political universe at 10 years old. And I just became kind of enthralled with it. I guess it was my first up close race. And it was, I guess I can say the year and just go ahead and date myself. It was 1968. So it was a big political year in the nation, but for a race for Congress to be centering on my hometown, it was a pretty big deal. So I got interested in it, but I was 10 and you wait 4 years for another election, right? And so nothing really in between that, but I got involved. Actually, it was my high school psychology teacher that I think 1976 was spending a little more time teaching us about political philosophies than he was psychology that year. But I was just eating it up, and then still went on to college. Not planning to. I didn't know you could major in political science, and boy, when I learned I could spend 4 years studying this, I was just like, hot dang, that's where I'm going. And so, it was just kind of just an interest. I found it fascinating, the personalities, the competition, all of it. Then I got the great chance to study it at ASU Jonesboro. And we just had lots of one-on-one time in those days with the professors. We talked politics in the halls and we talked politics in the break rooms and everywhere. And it was just a great environment. So that was sort of the education part. And then, I get out of college and I guess I just come back to the Delta where I'm from, small towns, and I see some rather disturbing things politically. I'd gotten involved, I should say, a little bit in college with college Republicans, more than a little bit, but still I'm more involved at the college level than I am in my hometown. And I come home and I see disturbing things. I hear disturbing things about voting and just funny business at the polls and people complaining. I was telling someone this morning, oddly, that it reminds me almost of some of what's going on now. But I was approached by a woman who might have been 30. I'm probably all of 24 at the time. And she told me she was afraid to go vote. And I'm thinking, this is the 80s. How could you be afraid to go vote? And she said, well, my landlord's working inside at the polls, and we sit down at the cafeteria tables and mark our big paper ballots. We don't really have privacy, and I'm afraid I won't have a place to live after I vote. And I mean, the fact that I still remember it, I mean, it made a humongous impact on me. And I don't even know what capacity. I might have been an election commissioner at that time. But that really struck me. I had a mayor of the same little town, maybe it was a previous election, tell me, little lady, hadn't you figured out how this thing works? I steal all the votes I can steal, and you steal all the votes you can steal, and whoever steals the most votes win. He was the mayor, tiny little town, later went to jail. So, not for that, but for something else. Obviously a corrupt individual, and he may have just been messing with me. But again, I'm taking him at his word. Didn't know the first thing about stealing a vote, but we had problems in that day and time, and that sort of kind of etched on me the need for us to have a two-party state, for accountability to be through two strong political parties. And I didn't know it would take nearly 40 years for that to happen, but 30 years, let's be a little more generous. But at any rate, I thought it was important to do, and I got involved because I thought that would be one thing that would maybe turn the tide of our state, to have two viable political parties. And for the record, I still believe that, even though we don't currently have two viable political parties.
We'll probably get into some of that and some of our other questions. I love the story and the things that are etched on your mind there from your previous experiences. We all get our start somewhere. So thank you for sharing. I really appreciate that. I know that you're doing something a little bit different than that now with Capital Consulting. What are you doing with them that kind of connects back to this work that you have learned over the years?
I was kind of tell you how I got there. We do political consulting of a variety of ways, but we help campaigns. So we help candidates devise their message. We help them convey that message, whether through print media, direct mail, or whether we help write scripts for YouTube ads that are used on social media, television, things like that. But we also lobby. I'm that dreaded lobbyist, one of the professions that people say their parents are not happy to brag on their kids for doing. But, when I taught political science at UALR, I would tell students the value of the lobbyist. And I do believe there's real value. Legislators, and by the way, let me say, we lobby at the state level. We do not do any federal lobbying. But legislators come into a session for 4 months, and they will vote on as many as 2,000 pieces of legislation in 4 months' time. They can't possibly be well-versed on every one of those pieces of legislation. And so part of our role is to educate them, to tell them why we need this bill, convince them to vote our way, of course, but to tell them why we need it and to help them explain it to them in such a way so that they can remember it, and maybe they can influence someone else they're sitting next to in the committee room. So we lobby and we work on affecting legislation that way. My partner, the hook he landed in me to get me possibly to leave was A, partnership, but B, he said, you may be able to impact more legislation now than you did as a legislator. And I thought, that might be an exaggeration, but it was nice to think about being able to be involved and make a positive change. And I can't lobby for something I don't believe in. So.
So you get to pick what you educate people on. So
Yes.
that's great. Well, over these past 30 years or however many you said that you kind of involved in this, I'm sure that there have been multiple success stories that you're particularly proud of. We'll be getting into more details in terms of how you worked across the aisle or worked with people who might be different from you in a little bit. But is there one success story that you're particularly proud of that you'd like to kind of start this interview with?
This one is particularly, I'm particularly proud of. This one, I should start this by saying, first of all, any success in politics, any win, isn't just one person. As John F. Kennedy said, victory has 1,000 fathers and defeat is an orphan. And I saw that a lot when I was in the legislature, people climbing all over each other to take credit for something. And I really don't like that. It's really cooperative. I never liked it when someone said, I passed a bill. No, you and a majority passed a bill. But people have to use the rhetoric they have to use. So I don't want to claim too much credit here, but I do have a quick success story, and I hope I can keep this one fairly quick. We were approached by someone who was just really interested in doing some philanthropic work. And this person had taken a real interest in the deaf and blind school, the deaf school and the blind and visually impaired school, two separate schools. We typically just refer to them as one. But he asked if I would go take a tour. And I did in the summer of 2023. And I had sat on education committee and was vice chair of education committee before I left the legislature. And I had only driven past the deaf and blind school. Deaf and blind schools prior to Asa Hutchinson's transformation, they were part of state, they were under state agencies. They weren't under the Department of Education. So I felt very remiss going to the deaf and blind school, as I'll refer to it, and not being aware of how much they needed over there. You can have a great school in a poor facility, but at some point, I think it starts to impact morale. And we saw some leaning handrails. This again, I don't know, my angles, leaning at a 30-degree angle. I mean, not really helpful to someone walking if the railing is leaning in the other direction away from the sidewalk. Air conditioning, non-existent, fire alarms in the dormitory that housed elementary schools. They didn't really have a good alarm system there. They didn't have sprinkler systems. You usually have an audio alarm, right? But if you're deaf, you can't hear the audio alarm. So the needs there, I was just kind of overcome and really came back to my office with feeling almost shame that I had been a legislator. Granted, it had already been 8 years since I'd left, but that I'd been a legislator and hadn't known about this. And so we took this project on and we began to talk to legislators about the deaf and blind school. And I'm pleased to say last Friday, they announced the construction contract for the new deaf and blind school, $65 million, and we're going to have a new school. And I'm not saying this because I want credit, but to me, it was deeply satisfying to know that I had a tiny part of that. Obviously, it took the governor primarily, but it also took the support of legislators going over to look and see how badly they had just kind of fallen through the cracks. And they had needed a cheerleader for some time and hadn't had one. And in that way, then the lobbyist kind of got to be the cheerleaders. We got to talk to the education committee chair and say, you really ought to go get a committee and go over and tour and see how badly they need your help.
So it sounds like with these stories that you've already started with, and that you really like being able to make a difference, that seems like something that's kind of a driving force for you, working with other people to make a difference. And so thank you for sharing those stories. Really appreciate that.
So let me ask you this. Now, one of the things that we do a lot of times, Ann, with our guest, is we inquire of them their political views. And in Braver Angels, because we insist on having equal representation on both sides of the fence, when it comes to making decisions and electing leaders, we talk about red-blue. So obviously red's more the conservative Republican side, blue more liberal Democratic side. I know very few people are pure colors, but for yourself, where would you place yourself on that red-blue spectrum?
Well, my voting record, we look at people's voting records when we do this, would be solidly Republican. Voted in probably every Republican Party primary going back to the 70s when I started voting. So I'm pretty red. That doesn't mean that I don't find fault with the directions and the actions of some people in my party. But I'm definitely still a Republican, at least for the time being.
Do you ever find any positives on the other side?
Oh, of course. I used to joke that every young person would want to be a Democrat because all the cool kids are on that side. I mean, their conventions are more fun. They've got the movie stars, the pop singers, and everyone on their side. And PJ O'Rourke said he likened the Republicans to Santa Claus, and Democrats to Santa Claus and Republicans to God. That Santa Claus gave you something without nothing in return, without wanting anything in return, and Republicans had a hard standard, and they just weren't nearly as much fun. And I always thought something about that sort of rang true, that sort of personal responsibility that we have to have. Yes, of course. And growing up and growing into adulthood, if I hadn't had Democrat friends, I wouldn't have had any because there just were so few Republicans. So, some people were Democrats because that's where everything happened. And there are going to be these days Republicans that are of that same ilk. They're Republicans because that's who's winning elections these days, more than an ideological Republican.
So you're primarily red, understandable. What are some of the key life experiences or values that you hold that led you to that direction politically?
Well, I would probably say that I would probably attribute it to coming of age. And when I was voting, my first year to vote, Jimmy Carter was elected. The next 4 years, I'm married pretty young. And so we're a young couple trying to make it on the farm. We was married to a farmer. I was in school, but I was married. So I was a commuter student. And we had a lot of really tough years economically between 1977 and 1980 when I was young married. And those were the years of who we blamed it on was Jimmy Carter's inflation. We struggled with high taxes and high inflation, and we also had a lot of bad weather too. But inflation was tough. Gas prices were high. It was tough economically during those years.
Yeah.
And so I say that some of that, again, I was probably already calling myself a Republican, but that made it more, maybe defined it a little bit more.
Yeah. So in many ways, Carter's time, it was a really tough time. And so like a lot of people, you attribute a lot of the problems to Carter, which is typically what happens with presidents. They get blamed for pretty much everything, for those they can control and those they can't. So you kind of talked a little bit about some of the way things have changed in terms of, there was a one-party system for a long time on the Democratic side. Now it's kind of the reverse. Now you've got a one-party system on the Republican side. But there've been a lot of changes over the years in how people identify themselves. Given the many years that you've been active in the Republican Party, what kind of changes have you seen among Republicans in Arkansas?
I think that's a really in-depth question that I'll try to keep my answer as succinct as I can. Well, first of all, when you do become a one-party state, you have people who are former Democrats that have now, they're sort of new Republicans. We have, I served with members in the legislature that got elected as Democrats and changed their party during our time together. So they're sort of new converts, and they were probably, in fairness to them, always a little conservative, but they were Democrats, and so they were sort of the Southern Democrats. Those people have joined the party. Again, some just for pragmatic. They really haven't thought much about politics at all. They're in the party. We've got, I guess you could say, my ilk, which is sort of my partner likes to say I'm a George H.W. Bush Republican. I'm like, okay, he did get elected while I was in college. Okay. I mean, I'm not like that ancient. So we have all kinds of folks in the Republican Party. That's the nature of us being a one-party state. And I think you've got the old timers. And then, of course, there was an influx of Republicans when President Obama was elected. And I struggled with that quite a bit because, I mean, as I put on Facebook a few years ago, I'm not really interested in somebody joining our party for racist reasons. And if we have to have those sorts of folks to win, I would just as soon not win. Frankly, some of those old Democrats that had old Democrat ways came over to our side. And then there's Trump. And Trump brought in so many new people that we had never seen locally before. Neighbors that had Trump signs that had never, ever had. I've lived in the same house for 24 years now. We've never seen a sign in their yard. And suddenly they've got Trump flags and Trump signs and all sorts of things. Those folks came in a little bit sort of, and they're not all men, but I'm going to use that sort of angry white male. You saw it somewhat with the Tea Party, but it's almost like the Trump is a little bit the Tea Party, maybe on steroids. They're very aggressive, and frankly, in my own county, there was an element of new folks that came in and joined and kind of wanted us to get out of the way and leave. They didn't really want our voice any longer, and it's quite a sort of a kick in the face to feel that, wait a minute, we've been pulling this wagon a long time, and now that we've gotten to the finish line, you want us to walk away. And I've been torn. I've been torn about whether it was time to walk away or time to stay and fight for fairness and decency and civility and all the things that Republicans used to be for, and I think still are the bulk, but there's some that have been kind of showing their ugly side even this election season.
Yeah, as you talk about civility and respect and that sort of thing, as you probably know, that is one of the key focuses of Braver Angels is whatever side you're on, try to treat everyone on the other side with respect and be willing to engage with some degree of civility so we can get things done. And so it sounds like some of that is kind of going by the wayside with some of that new generation that's come along. And with your longtime Republican conservative views now no longer being that welcome, that does sound like quite a change.
We haven't seen any humongous differences in the platform of the party. A few changes. Obviously, the past couple of years, we've seen quite a few changes in party rules. Again, it's more or less designed to bring in new folks and reduce the power of sitting legislators, for instance. So that's been a push, and I'm not really sure I understand. I understand that whole philosophy or what the end game there is. Okay. It's certainly not a big tent philosophy.
So given all of that you've had to, over a period of years, work with a lot of different people, you've seen the change from Democrats to Republicans, and then the different flavors of Republicans, including the Tea Party and Trump. I would imagine that in all that, you've had to work across differences of opinion and political views a number of times yourself. So you even talked about that in your early life. Most of your friends are Democrat because that's all you had. So tell me a little bit about how you experienced that in your own work, both in the Arkansas legislature when you're there and also maybe in your current practice.
Well, let me start currently. When you're trying to pass a bill, you don't really care where the votes come from. You just want that magic number. So I think in some ways, it's much easier in the role I am now to work across party lines. But there is, you've got to be careful. If you're working on a bill, you have to be careful that it doesn't become seen as a Democrat bill. So, if you're looking for a bill sponsor, you're probably going to need a Republican bill sponsor if you have something that you're wanting someone to bring to the floor. I would say that, again, it's much easier to work across party lines from the role I'm in now. When I was in office, I should probably tell this story. I mean, you had to work across party lines. When you come in, I was one of 28. So in 2009, in the 87th General Assembly, we had 28 Republicans out of 100. So we were pretty irrelevant. If we had all stuck together, we could have stopped a tax, right? Because they needed three-fourths vote for that tax increase. So I don't know. Afterwards, you look back at how you voted, and I thought, well, I don't have a reason not to vote for that bill. It's going to pass. I can vote for it. It's got 70 votes already. What difference does it make if I add one more? So I voted on a few things, in part, though, to sort of build some trust. I had a pretty big piece of legislation that I was wanting to run. I mean, big piece to me, significant to a number of legislators. I don't know that it was going to make any news stories, although it did end up making a news story. We proposed, it was my bill, I had proposed a change in the way we did travel for legislators, basically making them adhere to the travel reimbursement policy that the rest of the state had. You took the most economical travel. You couldn't drive to Seattle and get mileage or to Seattle and back. We shouldn't be paying someone $2,000 to drive to Seattle when you can fly to Seattle for $600. So it was just a simple little bill that didn't do much, as they used to joke around and say, this little old bill doesn't do much, appreciate a good vote, and they'd leave the well. That was kind of a joke inside the legislature. I had 48 or 50 co-sponsors on that piece of legislation, a good number of Democrats. Obviously, if we were only 28 Republicans, to get 50, and I went into the Rules Committee with that bill. Even though I had worked across party lines, I'd voted for Democrat legislation. I thought, I'm showing I can be a team player. Do you know that bill went into committee and I didn't get a second, even though probably a good number in that room had co-sponsored the legislation. So they had signed on.
But was it because of the Democrats supporting it, or what?
Well, so this was a Democrat in the committee, right? So okay. It was.
Well, that's right.
It was because this is the Democrat time period.
That's right. That's right. I forgot. Thank you.
Yeah. This is because it's going to limit their travel reimbursement.
Okay.
And I had people come up to me, and to be fair, let me just remind the listener that legislators at this time, I think, were making $13,000 a year in salary. So there were some little perks of office. And I mean, probably, if I'm frank, if there hadn't been a few perks, who would want to do it? I mean, it completely takes over your life and reduces the amount of money you can make in any other job you have, and including mine at UALR. You know, I took like half-time pay and things like that. So I was losing half my UALR salary for the benefit of $13,000. So they didn't want to give up that perk. And 2 years later, we did get that bill passed. But I will tell you, we were still a minority. The 88th General Assembly, we were still a minority. I think we had 45 Republicans that year. Don't quote me on that. Close to 45. I should remember. It was a big deal in those days. And I had someone approach and say, well, we're going to run your bill, but you can't be the sponsor of it. So I gave it up to the Speaker of the House to be the sponsor of the bill. And so that policy, I don't even know if they still go by that anymore, but that policy became law for legislators to have to follow basically the state travel reimbursement plan. But I was going to say, I had people that came up to me and said, well, how am I going to take my kids on vacation if I can't drive there? You know, it was family vacation time for a lot of legislators to go to legislative conferences and take the family along and stop along the way. And people took their grandkids, and it was, I'm sure it was a nice time. And I said, look, I'm all for you having a vacation with your family. I just don't think the state ought to have to pay for it.
Well, that's it for the first part of our conversation with Ann Clemmer, Glen, but there's more to talk about, and we're going to get to that in the second part of our conversation with Ann. Listeners can find that second episode on our podcast site, so we hope that they'll join us for that as well.
So when you do visit our website, you'll find links to all our episodes. You'll also be able to email us at otherhandar@gmail.com if you want to provide us with any feedback about our podcast or any suggested speakers or topics. We encourage you to look for previous guests from some of the other episodes that we've had. One that I think you might be interested in, since Ann is a former state legislator, is episodes 63 and 64 with Senator Breanne Davis. She's a current senator with the Arkansas legislature. So again, episodes 63 and 64.
On the Other Hand is sponsored by Braver Angels in Arkansas. Music was composed by Randall Standridge of Jonesboro, Arkansas, and was performed by the University of Northern Colorado Symphonic Band, Dr. Richard Main, conductor.
From your host, Glen White
and April Chatham Carpenter.
Let's all do what we can to bring our community closer together.